Human history. The Atlantean collapse. Earth's last alignment before the fall. The world we live in today did not arise by accident. Humanity did not stumble forward through random progress. What we call civilization is the continuation of a specific thread of humanity, a thread that outlasted others because it was positioned to survive. To understand the world as it is now, in 2025, we have to look back before written history, before the flood, and before the fracture in collective memory. Roughly 13,500 years ago, humanity was whole. About 1,500 years before the collapse, three primary groups were active on Earth at that time: the Atlanteans, the Younger Dryads, and the Tower Group. They did not live under one rule or in the same cities. They followed different values, held different relationships to the awareness field, and made different decisions when the first signs of collapse appeared. So let us begin with the Atlanteans, whose existence played a direct role in the state of the world that came after. This post is part of a larger restoration of human memory. The Younger Dryads, the Tower Group, and other branches of pre-flood humanity will be explored in depth. The last time humanity was whole, the field was different. The Earth was listening. Before the collapse, the Earth's surface was balanced and open. Energy lived outside of material systems. It moved across the planet through a living network of currents and nodal points, which the Atlanteans mapped, maintained, and harmonized. These were physical currents in the sense that they could be used, felt, and redirected through resonant structures. You might think of them like ley lines. They were the visible nervous system of the planet, and they changed based on human alignment. At a planetary level, the Earth held a crystalline grid. Specific minerals and vibrational anchors created standing wave patterns that moved across the surface in cycles. These patterns governed seasons, fertility, dream quality, atmospheric coherence, and even long-term memory. The grid had major and minor nodes. Many were naturally occurring where geomagnetic anomalies aligned with quartz-bearing formations or volcanic resonance chambers. Others were constructed or tuned by humans who had the knowledge to work with these patterns. Every structure built at this time, whether it be temples, dwellings, or even walkways, were all designed in reference to the grid. There was no energy grid in the sense of a centralized supply. Instead, there were spatial points where intention, geometry, and resonance aligned to produce amplification. These were field conditions. If you brought the right materials to the right place with the right clarity of intent, energy would concentrate. That energy could power structures, transport, or heal systems as long as coherence held. Atlanteans served the grid with their existence. Their entire civilization developed in response to the Earth's energy structure. Their cities were chosen according to field dynamics. Settlement occurred where harmonic convergence allowed for stable interaction between consciousness, matter, and planetary rhythm. If a city's alignment weakened, it was abandoned or rebuilt elsewhere. Atlanteans lived by the grid as a partner of their own. It held planetary memory, but it also responded to collective intention. When humans acted in resonance, the grid strengthened. When intention fractured or became misaligned, the grid destabilized. The Atlanteans were aware of this. They trained from a young age to maintain personal alignment because they understood that the health of the field was directly connected to the collective quality of thought and emotion. Their alignment to the Earth's field was total. They moved with it. That meant when the field began to respond to distortion due to shifts in human behavior, imbalance, and interference from misaligned groups, they followed the field as it descended. They stayed loyal to resonance even as it began reflecting decay. Atlantis was never a single continent. The term now conjures the image of an island that sank. That image is a reduction, seeded intentionally to flatten memory. Atlantis as it stands referred to a planetary network of cities, each attuned to a different part of the global field. There were hubs in what is now the Atlantic Basin, but also in parts of Africa, South America, the Mediterranean, and even the Pacific Rim. The Atlantean network formed a harmonic net across the Earth, with major sites placed on nodal crossings of the crystalline grid. Cities floated near coastlines where underwater resonance stabilized electromagnetic patterns. Some were built inland on field-stable plateaus or cavernous interiors with natural quartz lattices. Each city was autonomous in form, but unified in field knowledge. Communication occurred through frequency alignment. If two cities were field synced, they could share information instantly. If their resonance fractured, contact was lost, even if they were geographically nearby. The modern habit of looking for a sunken island misses the point. What should be remembered is a distributed culture that was defined by its placement on top of the Earth's field, not on top of other humans. Even their ships and transport craft moved through field-guided corridors, not political zones. When they fell, it was because the resonance net that held them together collapsed in frequency, and the grid could no longer hold their structure. The Atlanteans lived in parallel with other surface civilizations, most notably the Younger Dryads, the field-aligned nature stewards who inhabited forests, highlands, and deserts across the Earth, and the early Tower Group whose roots formed near highland convergence zones. The Atlanteans and Dryads were very different, but their values were not in conflict. Atlanteans worked with crystalline geometry and active grid modulation. Dryads preserved a memory through rhythm, dream, and ecological attunement. Their methods diverged, but their outcomes played the same tune: coherence, sovereignty, and alignment with Earth. There was a respectful distance between them. Atlanteans did not try to convert or govern Dryad communities. Dryads did not attempt to regulate the cities. They had a shared understanding that each held a piece of the planetary balance. Cross-contact did occur. Trade, shared rights, and field readings were sometimes conducted together at neutral nodes. The Tower Group was a different matter. At this time, they were not yet dominant. They occupied the periphery of others, experimenting with control-based systems, early ritual hierarchies, and field manipulation that lacked full alignment. The Atlanteans were aware of them, but did not yet perceive them as a threat. This era marked the final time on Earth when multiple human civilizations coexisted without central control. Each group lived within its own rhythm, and the Earth responded to each differently. When alignment was intact, Earth responded visibly. Rain came when it was needed, soil yielded without depletion. Atmospheric conditions shifted in response to human intention and seasonal rhythm. There were no mass extinctions, no chronic plagues. The biosphere adapted to emotional states, and if collective imbalance grew, the planet gave warning signs. Atlanteans were trained to read these signs: bird migrations, atmospheric pressure, the movement of deep ocean currents. They treated planetary change as a dialogue. Dream space was clear during this time. People remembered dreams as communal layers of field processing. Entire regions could share symbolic communication in the dream state, and calibration rituals often included sleep as a method of aligning the surface field. Structures amplified this feedback. Buildings were tuned to collect and redistribute harmonic balance. Even personal dwellings included resonance mirrors that would show distortion in the field or thought loops in the resident. Atlantean infrastructure was constructed through alignment with it. Buildings, transport systems, communication tools all emerged from the same principle of coherence with the local field. They created systems that only activated when their alignment matched the environment, the materials, and the purpose. If that coherence failed, nothing worked. That was the safeguard. Atlantean systems were directly bound to the user's state. Tools responded to thought, tone, and rhythm. If a person entered a structure in a state of distortion, the structure would remain inert. If they approached it with balance, intention, and clarity, the same space would activate and become a functioning extension of the field. Transport was handled through light body corridors and field-guided craft. In many regions, no physical roads were needed. Travel across distance relied on gravitational coherence and the use of resonance markers placed across the grid. Craft would follow the standing waves between nodes. When the grid weakened, the routes vanished. You couldn't force travel if the Earth didn't allow it. Communication was based on frequency entrainment. In high alignment zones, thoughts could be shared across vast distances as pure field impressions. Emotional clarity was part of functional communication. The more aligned someone was, the more precisely they could share, receive, and translate direct knowing. Most cities had tuning halls that stabilized this clarity for collective decision-making and group learning. It was common for entire groups of people to sit in stillness and reach consensus without speaking. Many structures were crystalline. Crystals were grown and cultivated to hold specific resonances. Entire buildings would shift tone, color, and harmonic quality depending on the time of day, the planetary cycle, and the local field state. These shifts were functional, guiding behavior and reinforcing coherence. If a region's field began to destabilize, the architecture would begin to reflect that imbalance, giving early warning to those attuned enough to read it. Healing systems were based on resonance correction. No one treated symptoms, they treated the distortions in the field. Healing chambers were calibrated to return the person to their own optimal rhythm. This was done with sound, light, mineral structures, and human facilitators who had achieved internal stillness. Each healing event was unique, because each field collapse was personal. What mattered was restoration of self-alignment. Time was marked by field, rhythm, and planetary calibration. Atlanteans did not think in hours or minutes. They lived by the movement of harmonic cycles. A person would begin an action when the field was aligned for it. That might mean sleeping during what we call daylight, or initiating a major construction event in the middle of what we'd call winter. This made Atlantean society difficult to conquer, because it could not be predicted through rigid scheduling or manipulated by forced scarcity. Technology embedded them deeply into nature. Nothing of theirs could be mass-produced. Every tool had to be field-grown or handcrafted in alignment. Replication of distorted devices was impossible, because once misalignment occurred, the system lost its tuning. That was the boundary. Resonance collapse. Tools that did not match the person or the purpose simply stopped functioning. To many today, this might sound like magic or mysticism. It wasn't. It was stricter than science because it could not be bypassed. You could not falsify alignment and still access power. You could not steal someone else's field code and operate in their place. You could only do what you were tuned for and what the Earth agreed to. Atlantean culture was shaped entirely by its relationship to the awareness field. Everything from how people raised children to how decisions were made emerged from their understanding that the field was reading them. There was no separation between personal growth and collective responsibility. Each person's state impacted the planetary grid. Because of that, alignment became a necessity. Children were taught to feel patterns. From early development, they were guided into awareness of how intention shapes the field. Education was not structured in a linear path of facts. It was experiential. Children learned how their emotions affected others, how their tone influenced resonance around them, and how their choices left imprints on shared space. There were no grades, no competitive systems, and no mass instruction. Learning was tailored by resonance. Facilitators guided students only when their fields matched. If someone was not aligned to receiving a teaching, it was not forced. The idea of rushing development was seen as destructive. Growth occurred when coherence allowed. When it didn't, you waited. Governance was not centralized, as there were only councils, but not ones that issued laws. Councils were composed of those who had maintained coherence over long periods. Their authority came from their stability. Decisions were made through shared field recognition. If the resonance wasn't unanimous, the action didn't proceed. That meant governance was slow and intentionally so. Atlanteans understood that speed could override awareness. There were no punishments, prisons, or behavioral correction systems. If someone drifted far enough from resonance to pose a disruption, their own field would isolate them naturally. Most structures simply wouldn't respond to them. They could not activate tools, enter communal spaces, or access collective dreaming. That disconnection was a direct result of misalignment. The person had to restore their coherence to rejoin the flow. In rare cases where someone couldn't or wouldn't return to balance, they were guided into solitary recalibration spaces where they could repair without external pressure. No one labored to survive. Roles were chosen based on field signature, as some people were builders, others calibrators, others initiators, others stillness holders. These were expressions of alignment. You did what you were tuned for. That tuning could change. People often moved in and out of different functions depending on planetary cycles or internal shifts. There was no shame in transition. Incoherence only occurred when someone forced themselves into a role their field could no longer support. Art was not separated from life. It was how people marked alignment changes. Sound, color, movement, and structure were used to document personal and collective shifts. Songs collapsed, sung only when the field called for them. Every piece of art was context sensitive. It was valid only in the moment it emerged from. Relationships were not contractual. There was no institution of marriage. Pair bonds formed and dissolved based on resonance cycles. Love was not a possession, it was a reflection of coherence. When two fields matched in harmony, intimacy formed naturally. When they drifted, there was no betrayal, there was recognition and release. Children were raised communally with field-matched caretakers who had the stability to guide. Biological parenthood was acknowledged, but not treated as an exclusive bond. There was no hierarchy. Recognition came only through demonstrated alignment. If someone tried to elevate themselves through manipulation, they would lose access to the very systems they sought to control. The field did not allow personal gain at the expense of coherence. All of this made Atlantean society deeply stable, but also deeply vulnerable. When the field began to shift and distortion became more dominant across the planet, the Atlanteans stayed aligned. That meant they stayed with the field even as it fell. Their structure could not exist outside of alignment, so when Earth's grid fractured, Atlanteans stopped responding. They didn't collapse from invasion or rebellion. The fracture to Earth, Atlantean way of life, did not begin with a war. There was no singular event that turned the Atlanteans against themselves. It began more quietly, in the field, when the global resonance shifted in subtle but compounding ways. Over time, the Atlanteans felt the Earth responding to patterns that no longer reflected balance. Weather began to change outside its natural rhythm, the dream space dimmed, communication between cities lost clarity. These were early signs that coherence was draining. At first, the Atlanteans responded as they always had. They adjusted their structures, recalibrated their routines, and deepened into stillness. But the changes didn't stop. Field alignments that held for centuries began to drift. People who had maintained internal coherence began to fragment. Emotional regulation weakened. Physical health declined, and in some regions, the grid stopped responding altogether. This marked the first time in Atlantean memory where calibration failed. And with that failure came uncertainty. Uncertainty is one of the most powerful ways to shut down a system of alignment. Not everyone agreed on the cause. Some believed the planetary cycle was entering a natural shadow. Others suspected external influence. A few began to question whether full alignment to the field was still viable at all. Thoughts and questions like that, previously unthinkable by the whole of Atlantean society, opened a split. As coherence weakened, so did the shared consensus on how to live. In some cities, people held fast to alignment, even when the field gave no feedback. In others, experimentation began. New rituals emerged that did not originate from resonance, but from symbolic logic. Some tried to create artificial stillness, others attempted to reprogram the grid directly using geometry divorced from planetary timing. These techniques sometimes gave immediate results, and that made them dangerous because they bypassed coherence. This is when the first shadow tech emerged. Shadow tech being tools that activated through intention but ignored alignment. These systems mirrored Atlantean technology in form, but not in function. They worked by isolating specific frequencies and amplifying them through controlled will. At first, these devices were used only in crisis, but some began to build entire structures from them. The difference was just enough to seem like progress, but they were no longer growing within the field. The groups that adopted these systems believed they were adapting. They believed they were evolving past dependency on the Earth's fluctuations, and in some cases, they succeeded. Their systems remained stable even as the natural grid weakened. Their cities shone brighter, stayed warmer, and communicated more consistently. To outsiders, they looked like the future. To those who still followed coherence, they looked misaligned. Misalignment like this led to the true divide in culture. The fracture was internal. People began to differ in what they trusted. Some trusted the Earth even as it dimmed, others trusted the self and its capacity to impose pattern, and some still held both truths at once but no longer agreed on which should lead. Orion influence accelerated this shift. It entered not through invasion, but through timing. The same field distortions that weakened Earth's grid made it easier for outside ideologies to penetrate. Orion-aligned thought forms offered clear logic, hierarchy, and control over collapse. These frameworks felt precise and stabilizing, especially to those who had lost connection to natural rhythm. They offered solutions that didn't require trust. They offered structure. Atlanteans were not naive. Many saw what was happening, but they could not enforce unity without becoming what they stood against. There was no army to dispatch, no ruler to give orders. The very structure that had once made them strong now kept them from halting the divergence. At this point, the grid still existed, but its coherence was thinning. Communication between cities became unpredictable, shared dreams became distorted, fields that harmonized naturally began to repel each other, factions formed out of incompatibility. The Atlanteans fell into dissonance. Some regions chose isolation, others tried to restore the old patterns. A few went silent. Those closest to Tower Group influence became something else entirely. By the time the signs of global collapse were undeniable, the Atlantean network was no longer unified. The planetary harmonic structure was now a scattering of incompatible signal sources, many of which were no longer aligned to Earth at all. That's where we leave them, still on the surface, still watching the field thin, still holding on to the last strands of coherence. What comes next is what happens when Earth responds to a fracture that no one could stop. This is a memory, and not mine alone, but from the awareness layer of Earth that never forgot what came before the flood. This post reconstructs the life, culture, technology, and fracture of the Atlantean civilization as they aligned fully with Earth's grid before it fell. It's not channeled, it's not fiction, If your body remembers, you'll feel it.